Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the 5th annual JLF Houston here at Asia Society Texas Center. My name is Michael Buning. I'm the Director of Performing Arts and Culture here at Asia Society Texas Center. On behalf of ourselves and our partners, Imprint and Teamwork Arts, we'd like to welcome you to the JLF Houston and our current session, Points of Departure, Naheed Phiroze Patel and Sonal Kohli in conversation with Ragini Tharoor Srinivasan. This is presented by Shazma and Arshad Mateen. In this session, two writers examine literary journeys involving both their motherland, India, and other worlds. Naheed Phiroze Patel's latest book, Mirror Made of Rain, is a devastating coming-of-age novel about the wounds of inherited trauma. Sonal Kohli's book, The House Next to the Factory, charts 3 decades of a rising India. In conversation with Ragini Tharoor Srinivasan, they take us on a journey through the stories, memories, and histories through which their work navigates. Naheed Phiroze Patel is a graduate of the MFA program at Columbia University School of the Arts. Her writing has appeared in the New England Review, The Guardian, LitHub, Poets and Writers, HuffPost, Scroll In, Bomb Magazine, Public Books, PEN America, The Rumpus, Europe Now Journal, A Symptom Journal, and among others. Sonal Kohli's stories have been shortlisted for the Bristol Story Prize and Fish Short Story Prize. She is the author of The House Next to the Factory, out in India and forthcoming in the UK, and available for sale here today. Ragini Tharoor Srinivasan is an assistant professor of English and Transnational Asian Studies at Rice University, where she works on ethnic, post-colonial, and Anglophone literature and theory. She is an award-winning former magazine editor, freelance essayist, and a co-editor of Thinking with an Accent. As with our other sessions, this will be followed by a Q&A where you will be able to ask your own questions. But let's get started. Let's please welcome to the stage Naheed Phiroze Patel, Sonal Kohli, and our moderator, Ragini Tharoor Srinivasan.
Hi, everybody. Should we test our mics? Do we have mic tests?
Testing.
We were joking earlier that if my questions aren't good, we'll stage a kind of contest here with between the two of them. So I'm Ragini, and it's really a pleasure to have a chance to be in conversation with two terrific debut writers, Naheed Phiroze Patel, author of Mirror Made of Rain. I have props, these beautiful books, and Sonal Kohli, House Next to the Factory. And these books are both beautiful, very different formally and stylistically, but they share, and I think this is why JLF has invited us to be in conversation together, they share an investment in thinking about history and futurity, about inheritance, and as I think the title of this panel would suggest, in examining dynamics of arrival, departure, and return in sort of a very nuanced way. So in part because these are our first books, and because of the sort of titular invitation, Points of Departure, I wanted to start by asking both of you a question about your points of departure as writers, and a question about inheritance. So if I can sort of ask it two different ways, and then I'll pass the mics to you. Sonal's book begins with an epigraph from Anita Desai's Clear Light of Day, which I'll just read a little bit of. This epigraph from Desai: with her inner eye, she saw how her own house and its particular history linked and contained her, as well as her whole family, not binding them, but giving them soil and food to make them grow and spread. And I was wondering, Sonal, if you could talk a little bit about this idea that you take from Desai, or that you start with, of a history that is soil, that does not bind but allows to grow. I mean, there's a way in which sometimes we think of the past as a fetter, right, as a limit, as something that you're trying to get beyond. But you have a very, I think, different kind of vision, and I'm interested in how it might extend to your own literary influences, the traditions that maybe don't bind and overdetermine you, but have allowed you to grow as a writer. And Naheed, the version of the question I want to ask you has to do with, I think, Michael's introduction, he was saying that one of the subjects of the book is the inheritance of trauma. And the book in part depicts violence that, as you write, violence that could be transmitted by actions that might to a bystander appear entirely innocent. There's another moment in the book where you say memories are contaminated with our emotions. The past is a fable we teach to ourselves. And I'm wondering if you could expand for us a little bit on your book's vision and your vision of history and your relationship to literary history in particular. So big questions, but whichever one of you would take it up first.
I can go first. It's a complex question, and I think it's 2 or 3 parts. I'll address it like as I go. So for me, I think past more as a fetter, more as something that we want to leave behind. For me, it's more as something that we carry with us wherever we go. And like this particular epigraph, it was something that I came to after I had written the book, and I felt it sort of captured the essence of the book. How this family, the various members, they live in a house that's next to the factory. It's sort of an isolated place. They're living in an industrial area, and it's sort of an island where it's very contained. It's also claustrophobic. It's sort of lonely because it's not a residential neighborhood. And it's this sense of loneliness I feel that the characters carry with them throughout life. The protagonist of the book, we see her at various stages of her life, from the point when she's born, and then she's 11 or 12, she's 25, and then she's 30. As the book spans 30 years, she turns 32. And it is this enduring sense of loneliness that she's not able to shake away, that she's trying to get away from in a way, but it becomes a part of her, and she's also looking for happiness in life. And it's kind of a balance between loneliness and happiness that she arrives at towards the end of the book, I feel. The second part of the question was, I think, about
well, just about like literary influences. I mean,
Yes.
I think that's a beautiful vision of thinking about the protagonist Kavya, right?
Yeah.
Who at different stages of her life, of course, you're at a particular stage of your writerly journey.
Yes.
And so maybe the question is just to say, what would be the short account of your points of departure as a writer that you'd share with the audience?
I came to writing quite late, and I started to read seriously quite late too. And I think one of the biggest points of departure for me from a person who had undergrad in economics and then moved to writing was encountering Indian writing in English. And I felt that when I read these books, I had a great sense of, familiarity, which I did not feel when I was growing up reading books like Enid Blyton and Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys. I always felt, that these were stories that were removed from my day-to-day life, from my existence, from the world around me. And encountering Indian writing in English, I just felt that I had, there was a great sense of familiarity in the terms of the people, food, atmosphere, culture, weather, which I found very alluring, and I think that made me see the stories around me and sort of want to put them down on paper.
Thank you. I mean, and I think Naheed, you would probably narrate your relationship to writing a little bit differently, right? I mean, I'll pass you the mic in this awkward way.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that the talk has been titled Points of Departure, because for me, it was very much a return rather than a departure, because I kind of circle back to things that I'd been thinking about for a long time, and which I finally had an opportunity after trying various careers as a lawyer and as a journalist to explore through the medium of fiction. And the blurb in so as a book exists in the world, the way you talk about it alters slightly. So at the start, when the book first came out, we were talking a lot about inherited trauma. But as I've done these conversations and talks and had an opportunity to kind of engage with other readers and writers, I feel like the book is more about how we are conditioned and socialized to view ourselves through the eyes of those around us. And that's why the whole play on mirrors happens. And it's also like, especially young women from a very young age, we're kind of like told that we are only as good as what others can see in us. And it is about being trapped in that sort of hall of mirrors. And for a long time, I didn't have the language to articulate or talk about this, even though I saw it in my daily life and I experienced it and I was clearly chafing under it. It was only much later on when, after I did my MFA and I read other writers, I just read this really cool quote by Zora Neale Hurston on Twitter actually, and she says that, you know, if you don't speak out about your pain, they'll say you enjoyed it. And so I saw other writers kind of speaking out about the things that they were preoccupied with, and slowly I developed my own language and my own way of being able to speak about things that I'd been thinking about for a long time. So for me, it was very much a return rather than a departure. I'm hoping the next novel, whenever it is, will be actually an actual departure, and I'll move on to other things.
Maybe I can actually ask you a follow-up on that, Naheed, and then I'll come back to Sonal to some of the provocations that you put on the table. I mean, so for those who haven't read Naheed's book, one of, I think, the subjects that you just were touching upon is patriarchal norms and expectations, and as you said, you know, what it means to be in a society that is constantly asking you, and in this case, asking the protagonist, Numi, to sort of see and understand herself and her worth and her subject position in relationship to others and their expectations and their demands, people in the family, but also in sort of communities broadly defined. And so the book includes, you know, very frank discussions of Numi's sex life, of her mother's alcoholism, of her alcoholism, of depression. There are some, you know, what we would call, you know, fairly toxic relationships between some of these characters. And what I want to point out here, and what I want to invite you to say something about, is the fact that, you know, so there are some unpleasant women characters in the book, right? Again, alcoholic, depressive, engaged in certain kinds of self-destructive behaviors and so forth. But they're all really importantly in service of the book's larger critique of a patriarchal society. And I've heard you and read you in some interviews saying that, you know, that, for example, as an example, when men fail at parenthood or when men fail as partners, society has a lot of empathy and sympathy for them. And when women fail as mothers or as partners, right, they fail on their own. I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing something that you've said. So I guess the question is, why and how does the critique of patriarchy on offer in the book actually require the depiction of women failing and floundering?
That's a really interesting question. And I don't think that the book, it does kind of, rather than critique patriarchy, it kind of tells it like it is. Like there's no, the thing about the book is that I never wanted to put my hand on the scale for any character. So, and there's no like expositional, like this is what the reader must think. I really tried to my best, you know, to be like a nature documentarian. I'm just showing the world as it is seen through the eyes of the protagonist. And I think that when it comes to unlikability, well, for one thing, I feel like we really don't know what to do with women's anger. And we don't know how to place it in society, because I feel like, again, like, you know, there is an affect, there is a societal compact that we have that women should be nurturing and kind and nourishing and calm. And when there are none of those things, we kind of throw our hands up and say, okay, we don't know what to do with you. And I think that the characters, especially Numi's character in the book, she is reacting to the world around her, but not in a necessarily healthy way. And she wants to do something. She wants agency, but she doesn't know how to seek it. And in a twisted sense, her unlikability is her agency, because the only thing she can do in certain situations is be really unpleasant and not play along and not go along with the ruse that is expected of her in many situations, you know?
Yeah, and actually, we can talk about this more later, what I was describing as her unlikability is also actually likable to the extent that at moments it is sort of admirable and definitely funny. So I want to ask you about that. And I want to ask Sonal also, you know, following up on something you said earlier about influences and the discovery of Indian English literature, you've read, you've studied with, a number of writers, famous writers who some of our audience members also will know, like Amit Chaudhuri. I think you've said that you took inspiration also from Lahiri. And I think that one of the things that you do really beautifully that is perhaps in conversation with writers like that, right, is invite us to look at the everyday, ordinary kind of world around us, right? What we might consider the banal and the quotidian, and see it, perhaps with the documentarian's eye. I don't know if that word sort of is one that you would use, but certainly to think about. Maybe it's kind of magic. I mean, to go back to the morning session with Chitra, we were talking about magic. Because the language that you use to describe the ordinary, as I was reading it, I was thinking, okay, on the one hand, this is a book of interlinked stories. Something else I want to ask you about. Not a whole heck of a lot happens in some of the stories, right? And that's not a criticism, right? It's an observation. But your language is very suggestive and evocative. So we have, neem trees that are soaked in moonlight and look like they're made of stainless steel. And we have apartment mates in Paris who imagined themselves in a Chekhov play with the aid of a faulty kettle. So I'd like to ask you about what the ordinary is for you and the everyday, and how we might think about the way you want to see it and write it. And
when you say that, nothing much happens in these stories, you're so right, and I definitely don't take it as a critique. If anything, I take it as a compliment, because with my stories, all I'm trying to do is inhabit the moment, and just be in that moment, and not only in the characters' lives, but also what's happening in the background life of the story, of the house that they are in, of that evening unfolding. And it's just, I think I find a lot of magic in these ordinary moments, just, a screen door clapping shut, an orderly, somewhere in the book, an orderly is asked to wear a shower cap in the house because his hair is falling out, and, the family doesn't want his hair in their food, and he's rightfully, a little chagrined about it. And I just find, sort of magic and beauty in these moments, and that's what I tried to capture through my work.
And I think it definitely comes across. And I really think it makes one ask, when I think in the U.S., Seinfeld was an occasion for people to think about, like, oh, what would it mean actually for nothing to happen in this show or like in this book? And of course, it makes us question what nothing means. And I think Manil Suri was just offering us a different answering that question on a different register. But then also, what is an event, right?
Yes.
What does it mean to be an individual in history experiencing the event of the ordinary, or like the drama of the mundane or something? One of the things that I think links both of your books in an interesting way, and there's sort of like there's a kind of the obvious thing to say, and then I'll try to say it slightly differently because I'm curious how you're both thinking about it. But both of the books are about families and about multi-generational households, actually, more specifically, right? A multi-generational complex or compound, and homes in which cousins and uncles and aunts and siblings and grandparents are in proximity, and sometimes that proximity is unbearable, and then when they separate, sometimes that's unbearable, sometimes it's a relief, and so forth. And you both tackle this subject differently. And I'm curious, and again, so the different versions of the question, Sonal, what I would ask you is, these stories are interlinked, right? So, the house next to the factory, each of the stories in some ways deals with the life or of someone who has a relationship to the house next to the factory. And so the characters are sort of like in the same narrative universe, broadly defined, but they don't necessarily know each other. And so I'm curious if you would say that they do know each other. This is a sort of concept question, but in what way do they know each other? That's kind of a question about that. And Naheed, as we were talking, Numi is an individual struggling against society's apprehension of her, is one way of putting things. But she's also negotiating what we would call, I think in today's parlance, like a social network and the demands of the social network. And I'm curious if social network, and this is, I mean, I'm curious if social network may be a useful way of thinking about the multi-generational compound and the kinds of communities you both are thinking with. Or maybe not. I mean, maybe I'm forcing that language.
So when I started to write this book, I knew I was writing a book of stories, but I did not know if or how they would connect. I decided to write the stories as they came to me. So I wrote one, and then I had another idea. I wrote that. Then I wrote a third one. And after I had written 3 or 4, I just stopped to think whether I should now, sort of see if there's an underlying theme, and then write the remaining stories to that theme, so that, to have some sort of a continued narrative, even though these were stories. But it just felt that I didn't want to force those connections on the book, so I just continued to write the stories as they came to me. And I think 2/3 of the way into the book, I could see that all of these characters came from the same universe, and I could see that some of the characters were already reappearing in other stories. So, and once I understood that, I saw that the house was central to the book. And it was only the last 3 stories that I wrote with this knowledge that it is a house, it is a family, it's a tutor connected to the family, it's a servant who works in the family. So that was how I linked the stories.
Thank you.
It's funny, when you say social network, like the first thing that came to my mind is like social media. And it is kind of like a multi-generational situation is sometimes like social media, because everybody has something to say about you and the way you dress and what you're wearing. And when we first meet Numi, it's in a very high pressure situation with this high society party, and everyone's like, checking everybody else out, and the milieu is very like, I read a lot of Edith Wharton before writing this book, and I just wanted to kind of capture that sense of like, precarity in terms of social standing and things like that. And yeah, I think that that's actually a really good analogy, but maybe not in the way that you meant it.
No, I know. I mean, I think yes, and like I guess social network. I mean, I've been trying to think a little bit, and I think some, the literary critics are trying to think about, whether or not social networking is a good way of thinking about character relations in literature. And I mean, so there's a kind of like way of thinking about whether the network is a useful, formal category for thinking about the structure of text. I mean, and your book is also, in a sense, right, about a network that stretches not just spatially but in time. But yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of curious again, because since we all live. Many of us live in social media in some ways, or the multi-generational family drama is unfolding on WhatsApp or something. And I mean, the book doesn't necessarily talk about WhatsApp, but there's some of that, the relentlessness of it that's on offer in your book. For you, I think that the book pace of your book is not relentless, but the connections are there, right? And they're stretching in space and time.
I mean, I never thought to write a multi-generational book. In fact, after I had finished the book, somebody, while I was, sending it out to publishers and agents, somebody suggested, why don't you turn this into a multi-generational Indian saga? And it was, at that moment, I realized that I'm not interested in that kind of a story. What I'm interested is in these episodes and how they connect. And even if I were to write this book again, I would never turn it into a multi-generational book. It does. It does not interest me.
And that's so interesting, right? That you say, it's not about a multi-generational story, but it's about the episodic, right? Which is another, I think, important term to think with respect to your book. Of course, this novel is sort of like comparatively plot-driven, but of course, full of sort of rich episodes and anecdotes. And I actually want to ask you, Naheed, if I may, and you were mentioning Edith Wharton. Some folks might not know all the references, but you write a number of party scenes, and you write a lot of really funny scenes. And and the humor of your book, Naheed, is something that a lot of the blurbers and commentators and reviewers have mentioned. And I mean, I'll tell the audience here, like, the book is very funny and it's kind of scandalous and very sexy. A woman receives a diamond solitaire ring as a surprise gift from her husband. And can I tell them what the narrator says? The narrator says, later we'd found it was for surprising her with an STD because he made frequent business trips to Thailand. In Kamalpur, where some of the text takes place, you know, an income tax raid was a status symbol. And these kinds of commentaries, right, wry, smart, sharp, incisive, they give us the world on offer here. And I guess I'm just wondering, why was it important to you for the book to be funny? Because it's clearly so darn funny. Even as it's also so painful in a lot of ways.
It's funny, one of my friends who was an early reader, she said, I don't like your main character. I don't like her at all. I do like how bitchy she is, though. And I like the juxtaposition of these really funny, bitchy comments with like the very lyrical descriptions, because there are other moments where you do feel like that you know, it's more poetic and lyrical, and like the way she talks about, especially her father and stuff, you get another sense of her. But I guess like that's the voice that organically developed during the many drafts that I wrote. And I just wanted people to get a sense of that world, and also like how kind of, you know, the world that's how people talk to each other, you know, like that's the currency. Gossip is the currency that's exchanged.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And gossip is just the right word, right? There's a lot of really brilliant dialogue, right?
Yeah, so for some people, so there's been a really diverse range of reactions to the book. For some people that feels intimate, and for some it feels off-putting. So it really depends on who you are as a reader and what stage of life you're in, I guess, you know?
And as you said, whether the reader has how the reader's going to respond to an angry woman, for example.
Yeah.
And her thoughts. And we, you know, as many readers are bringing the same kind of baggage that you describe probably on offer in the book, right? In that social milieu. So.
Yeah, I would encourage, and I do enjoy making space for those opinions as well, because I just, you know, if you have a reaction to this character where you integrally don't like her, I just want the reader to pause and wonder if that is really their social conditioning kind of kicking in, because that's what society does with unlikable women, is that they, you know, if they can't be tidied away, then they don't know what to do.
Right. No, what's wonderful about thinking about these texts together also is that they provoke very different kinds of questions, I think. And
Hope you're going to say that my book is sexy too. I would love
It's a very sexy book. Different, and of course I'm following that. I was going to ask you another high concept question though, because I think of it as like a very philosophical book. I will admit, I was not about to say it's sexy. No, but I mean, philosophy is sexy. I think this audience is here on Saturday listening to, you know, writers. So I think everybody here agrees. I mean, what I was going to ask you. Now I want to. So maybe you should tell us the sexy backstory of the book. There's no sexy backstory? What I was actually going to ask you was sort of like about the metacritical reflection on writing and literature that I think is on offer in this book in sort of subtle ways and moments throughout the book. So, for example, there's you know, one of your characters, Hema, is writing a letter and about her encounter with snow, right? She's experiencing snow for the first time, and she says, I couldn't have imagined snow to be, you know, soft and flaky. And she says, all those Russian novels led me to understand it basically differently. And there's other moments, for example, when there's a German student of Sanskrit who says, you know, I came here because I want to read the Mahabharata after I saw it on TV. And there's a lot of interesting moments like this where I think the characters give us an opportunity to reflect on the mediating powers of literature, media, film, and how they inflect our experience of the everyday that we were talking about earlier. And so I wanted to ask you, how you understand, and especially as you said, you came to writing relatively late, or sort of, it's not a race, right? But what does literature do? Like, what does it do to this world that you were already describing as kind of magical in its ordinariness?
I was very aware that I did not want to overtly write a character who's sitting somewhere reading a book. I mean, I did have the opportunity in Ten Bela Road, which is the story of an evening unfolding in an old colonial bungalow in Delhi. And the character is sitting there doing a jigsaw puzzle. And my first thought was, maybe she'll be sitting there reading a book throughout the evening and while the story is unfolding. So I wanted to sort of because it's so easy for a writer to write about characters who are readers and who to put a book in there or literature in there overtly. But I think it's more like the question that somebody asked Chitra, do you think literature changes the world? I think it changes us, changes the reader one book at a time, and literature a whole as a canon. So what I have done, I think, is use literature more as a lived experience rather than put it in there in the book. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Are either of you interested in asking anything to each other as we are sort of talking? I keep hogging the mic in the middle again.
I was just curious with Sonal, like, how difficult was it to kind of, because I'm imagining that you wrote this from distance from, your experience. Like time had passed, like you wrote this many years after, having grown up in Delhi and stuff like that. How difficult was it to access those sights and sounds, and was there something that triggered, productivity? Not productivity is such a terrible word, but you know what I mean, like,
Yes. I mean, I just feel that, I started writing this book while I was living in India, and then I was in UK for a year for my MA, and I was writing it there. And then I came to the US, and I was still working on it. But I just feel that, the further I move from India, the more vivid it becomes for me. And it does not, I mean, I've not visited India in 6 years, but when I'm writing the book, I am just there. And for me, a large part of writing about India is also going back to that landscape and to inhabit it all over again. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in a very weird sort of way, I don't feel outside that landscape when I'm writing. And it's also my way of accessing it.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful.
It's actually very, very beautiful, and also I think provokes some other interesting questions about, writing as a practice of return. As you're saying, when you're writing, you're inhabiting the landscape that you are not physically in, right? But that you recall, that you remember. It sounds in that way like a project of recovery. Yes. And, of course, a lot of folks have thought about, literature as a practice of memorialization, right? Like you write it, and so then you can live in it, is sort of what you're saying. I wonder, though, if it's also that the other side of that coin is that you're not just writing to remember and inhabit, right? But writing in some sense in order to be able to leave behind and also then live in a different present and future? Or is that not quite right?
I'm not there yet. I think I'm writing to relive that time. I'm working on a short novel right now, and monsoon is a season that I really, really miss, and I've set that book during the monsoons just to hear it and enjoy it.
If you like monsoon, you should spend more time in Houston also. What about you, Naheed, in terms of inhabiting the world, the landscape, the sights, smells, sounds, texture?
So, it's true. I think that, so I was reading this this memoir by Dara McNulty. He's a 17-year-old naturalist, and he writes about the natural world, and he's autistic. And he writes, the whole book is about him being in nature and these beautiful, lush descriptions of his, hometown in Ireland, those forests around his hometown. And there was something that he said that really stayed with me, which was that, when I'm out there, I don't think that I'm looking at anything. I'm worried that I'm missing things out. But then I come home and I start writing, and I realize all the things that I've noticed and all the things that I've actually, so it was like many times, being distanced, there's not only the distance of space, but also time between writing and, lived experience, and one feels afraid that I'm not going to remember anything, and I'm not going to get it right. And that's true, sometimes you don't, but like a lot of times you just sit down and you start writing and you discover, you remember, and you can really sensorily place yourself better than you would have been able to if you were just speaking to a friend or, having a discussion.
That's a theory of a philosophy of writing right there too. I should say, since I did say about the sexiness of this book, that this book also provokes a number of philosophical high concept questions. Awesome. And so forth. I've been a bit greedy with the time, but I suppose if there's one question from the audience for both of our two questions, we could permit them. In the middle, in the back.
Thank you. Especially the last part, I think it was very, very intriguing when you're talking about revisiting after the departure. Do you find yourself with that separation when you revisit, because nostalgia can be a very, very powerful hallucinogenic. So do you find yourself thinking about that more critically, or do you put on very rosy lenses when you're thinking about, essentially, does that separation change your perception? And does that help you in your writing?
I definitely think that, I try that my first view of the past is through the lens of nostalgia. But I try as much as possible to leave nostalgia aside and then really be in that moment as it was, or as it was in the life of the book. But nostalgia does creep in. I do try to keep it out, but it does creep in now and then.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that memory is really mutable and fallible, so you're never accurately remembering the past. And whether it's nostalgia tinged or not, I think depends a lot on what kind of person you are, or what kind of writer you are. I personally don't think I'm very prone to nostalgia, but who knows? I mean, it could creep in, and it could very much color what I'm writing about or thinking about. And I don't necessarily think that's a terrible thing. I don't think we can be purists at least when it comes to fiction. And when you're thinking back in the past, you're also trying to capture the point of view of the person that you were at that point of time. And it depends, did you like past you or not? So, and I think that the writing that follows will be very much causative, like a product of that. That makes sense.
Is there one more quick question in the back?
This might be a really cliched question, but I'm really interested for both of you. Who's your audience? What audience do you have in mind as you write about, India or these communities that are?
I can tell you about the readers that I can't really give you like a broad subsection of society that I think is my audience, but I can tell you that the readers who have really responded to the book are readers like Ragini, and people who are interested in stories that kind of go beyond the general tropes that we see when it comes, unfortunately, to Indian writing in English, and who are interested in complicated and books that don't necessarily have a nice pat ending, and who are also comfortable with unlikable characters, because frankly that's not everybody. So yeah, that's what I can generally glean from the people who've responded to me and to my work.
For me, I think I'm the first audience for my work, and because I spent such a long time writing it, I want to enjoy that experience, and I want, and by that I feel that at least I'm assured that one person will end up liking this book, not more.
The writer is the first reader.
Yeah.
I think all of you hopefully are the audience, and you have been. Thank you so much, and thank you to JLF for inviting me to introduce you, some of you, and reintroduce you to these really fabulous writers. Please give them a hand of applause.
Thank you, Ragini.
Thank you, Naheed, Sahal, and Ragini. And we have a couple gifts for you. So thank you again for joining us for Points of Departure, presented by Shazma and Arshad Mateen. I hope your interest was piqued by these two books. They are available for purchase at the Brazos bookstore stand outside in the Grand Hall, and they will be signing right now as well too, with the two authors. Encourage you to come back and join us at 4 o'clock for our next session, which will be Points of View, an archival gaze of photography in India, with Gayatri Sinha and Stephen Evans in conversation. Thank you again for joining us for JLF Houston.